You smell that? It's the stench of new money. Get the fuck away from my table. The words, sharp and venomous, sliced through the elegant hum of the Metropolitan Legacy Gala. They weren't whispered. They were announced, a declaration of war delivered in a voice accustomed to being obeyed. The murmur of conversation at the surrounding tables didn't just quiet, it evaporated. The gentle melody from the string quartet in the corner seemed to snag on a discordant note, and then fall silent. 100 heads, adorned with diamonds and old-world pedigrees, turned in unison. The very air in the St. Regis ballroom, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and $100 entrees, seemed to thin, crackling with a sudden vicious electricity. And then came the laugh. It was high and crystalline, the sound of a champagne flute shattering against a marble floor, a sound designed to broadcast superiority and inflict pain. Isabella Sterling, draped in a gown the color of blood rubies, leaned over the back of her chair. Her smile was a masterpiece of cruelty, a perfect, predatory curve of her lips that didn't touch the cold fire in her eyes. In her hand, a crystal glass, nearly full with a deep, dark Pinot Noir, glittered under the immense weight of the chandelier above. Before we get into the absolute madness that follows, I have to ask, what would you do in this situation? How would you react? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. And listen, if you're here for stories about the underdog biting back with the force of a titan, do yourself a favor and smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. You are in for one hell of a ride. Now, back to the gala. Without a flicker of hesitation, Isabella tipped the glass. It wasn't a splash or a clumsy spill. It was a deliberate, theatrical cascade. A stream of crimson wine descended like a corrupted waterfall, catching the golden light in a final, beautiful shimmer before it met its target. It soaked into the immaculate hair of the woman seated below, a woman named Serafina Vance. The cold liquid flowed across her scalp, a sticky baptism of malice, dripping past her temples, tracing a path down her jawline and streaking her custom-made saffron-orange dress in stains the color of a fresh wound. The sound of liquid hitting fabric and skin was unnervingly loud in the cavernous silence. It was a wet, insulting sound that seemed to echo off the gilded ceiling. Gasps erupted like isolated pockets of fire across the room. A few muffled, nervous laughs tried to break through the tension, but died just as quickly. And then, the phones rose. An instant constellation of glowing screens, their cameras hungry, ravenous for the scandal unfolding before them. A tech billionaire's wife, her face a mask of horrified delight, covered her mouth. A group of young men, heirs to fortunes they had never worked a day for, leaned back in their chairs, broad, entitled grins spreading across their faces as if they had just been served the evening's primary entertainment. Isabella Sterling threw back her head and laughed again, a triumphant, conquering sound. She was basking in the attention, drinking it in. "There," she declared, her voice carrying like a trumpet call over the stunned assembly. "That's much better. Orange was never your color, darling. Red suits you so much more." She dangled the now empty glass from her manicured fingers, tilting it this way and that, as if it were a trophy from a successful hunt. A few guests, eager to align themselves with the Sterling name, laughed on cue. Others clapped politely, their applause a soft, sinister patter in the tense air. Everyone understood the message. This wasn't just an insult. It was a public execution of dignity. This was a display of dominance, a brutal reminder of the established order. But Serafina Vance, the black CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, did not move. She did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not wipe the wine that was now dripping from her chin onto the pristine white linen of the tablecloth. She simply sat still, letting it run its course, her hands remaining on the table, perfectly composed, as if frozen in a state of unshakable, defiant calm. Her eyes, which had been cast downward, slowly lifted. It was not a hurried glance, not a desperate plea for help. It was a slow, deliberate, calculated motion. Her gaze traveled past the ruined table setting, past the stunned faces of the other guests, and locked onto Isabella Sterling with such quiet, concentrated force that the laughter in the room began to falter. One by one, the sycophantic chuckles were strangled mid-breath. The ripple of noise collapsed back into an even deeper, more profound silence. Isabella shifted slightly on her designer heels, her smirk stiffening at the edges, but she forced another giggle, tossing her long, dark hair as she played to her audience. "Come on now, don't be shy," she taunted, gesturing with a flick of her wrist at the glowing phones still aimed at their table. "Smile for the cameras, Serafina." Yet even she could feel the current turning. The spectacle was no longer entirely hers to control. The soaked woman in the ruined orange dress did not need words. Her stillness was a gravitational force, heavier than shouting, more potent than outrage. Every single drop of wine that fell from her chin to the tablecloth was an unspoken declaration. Every second of silence that stretched on built a pressure in the room that Isabella's laughter could not puncture. The grand hall itself seemed to bend and warp around Serafina's composure. The chandelier still sparkled above, a galaxy of imported crystal, but the spotlight had shifted. The woman dripping with wine was no longer the object of ridicule. She was becoming something else entirely, something unshakable. A center of gravity that every gaze in the room now circled, drawn in by a power they couldn't name, but could all feel. The hush didn't last, but the sound that replaced it was different. Whispers began to coil through the room like smoke, insidious and uncertain. One woman, her diamond necklace catching the light, leaned toward her husband. "My God, did you see that? She just sat there." Another man, a hedge fund manager with a cruel streak, chuckled low, shaking his head. "She won't last 5 minutes in this circle. Not like that. You have to fight back." But not all whispers carried scorn. From the far end of the table, a veteran investor frowned, his eyes narrowing not at Serafina, but at Isabella in her blood-red dress. A quiet murmur reached his neighbor. "Too far. That was too far." His words were barely audible above the almost silent click of a phone camera's shutter. The phones? Oh, they were everywhere. A dozen different angles captured the wine still dripping from the sleeve of Serafina's dress. Each frame, each short video clip, was already destined for social media feeds and gossip columns before the night was over. Some held their screens high and proud, their faces glowing with the vicarious thrill of someone else's humiliation. Others tried to record more discreetly, pretending to sip their champagne, while their lenses burned the image into digital memory. And then the laughter rolled back, scattered at first, then gaining momentum like a tide. The group of young heirs clapped one another on the shoulders. One of them, his eyes bright with a particular brand of inherited cruelty, leaned over to his friend. "She should be grateful. That Pinot costs more than her entire outfit, I'd bet." Their laughter was loud, harsh, and designed to fill the vacuum left by Serafina's refusal to scream, to cry, to react. A woman in pearls smirked as she adjusted her napkin in her lap. "Isabella is right. She doesn't belong here. Look at her. She can't even defend herself." Isabella, hearing these murmurs of support, lifted her empty glass once more, a conductor leading her orchestra of derision. She curtsied mockingly toward the still figure in orange, basking in the wave of validation from her chosen sycophants. "A toast," she announced, her voice ringing with performative glee. To the outsiders. More laughter, more scattered applause, more clinking of glasses. Yet beneath the noise, a different kind of tension stirred. Not everyone was laughing. A pair of senior partners from a rival firm whispered intensely behind their menus, concern etched on their faces. "That's Serafina Vance, isn't it? The Vance Innovations deal." The other nodded grimly, his eyes darting toward the woman drenched in wine. "The Sterling merger. The papers were signed this morning." Their amusement had curdled into profound worry. They knew what was at stake, even if the spoiled heiress in red clearly did not. Meanwhile, Serafina Vance remained motionless, a statue carved from obsidian resolve. She did not wipe the liquid pooling at her collarbone. She did not rise to her feet to defend her honor. Her silence became its own performance, a perfect, unflawed mirror in which every cruel voice, every ugly laugh was forced to see its own reflection. The louder the crowd jeered, the more her composure magnified their grotesque behavior. One young guest, who had been recording with a gleeful smile, slowly lowered his phone. He felt a sudden, unexpected pang of discomfort, of shame. He slipped the device into his pocket and stared intently at his water glass instead. A woman beside him frowned, her own laughter faltering as she watched the still figure, wine-soaked but unbroken. Something about the scene no longer felt amusing. It felt dangerous. It felt as if the entire gilded room was holding its breath, waiting for an inevitable, cataclysmic turn. Isabella, blissfully oblivious, blew a kiss toward the audience of cameras. "Remember this night," she shouted, spinning theatrically in her red dress. "This is what happens when you sit where you don't belong!" Her laughter burst again, high and wild, filling every corner of the opulent hall. But in the quiet space beneath that laughter, in the pause between the gasps and the claps, eyes began to shift. The balance was changing. Not everyone was laughing anymore. Not everyone was blind to what was about to come. And at the center of it all, wine dripping steadily from saffron silk to the marble floor, Serafina Vance waited. Her gaze never wavered. The wine dripped down her temple, slid past the curve of her cheek, and disappeared into the saturated folds of her dress. Still, she sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the table as if nothing had happened at all. Around her the room hummed with a nervous, crackling energy, laughter that was now too loud to be genuine, whispers that were too sharp, the clinking of glasses used to mask a rising sense of unease. But when her eyes lifted again, the noise seemed to dim, as if someone had slowly turned down the volume on the entire world. She looked first at the empty glass in Isabella's hand, the weapon that had been turned into a trophy. Then she raised her gaze higher, settling it directly on the woman in red. The self-satisfied smirk on Isabella's lips faltered. It was only for a second, a barely perceptible flicker, but in that moment of absolute silence, the crowd caught it. Serafina's stare was deliberate, unhurried, and piercing. She didn't need to speak. Her silence wrapped around her like a suit of armor, and the sheer weight of it pressed down on the room. Her composure had become the loudest thing in the hall. A ripple of profound discomfort spread through the guests. One man shifted in his chair, suddenly and acutely aware of how loud and foolish his own laughter had sounded just a moment ago. Another woman lowered her phone, a hot flush of shame rising in her cheeks at being caught recording such a nakedly cruel act. The cameras were still pointed in her direction, but their owners were no longer certain they wanted proof of what they were witnessing. Isabella tossed her hair, a nervous, reflexive gesture, and forced out a brittle laugh. "What? No comeback? Cat got your tongue?" She sneered, but her voice cracked, just slightly, at the edges. She leaned closer, her expensive perfume warring with the sour, fermented scent of the wine, waving her empty glass in a parody of triumph. "You should thank me. No stylist in the world could ever make you stand out like this." Her cruelty met only a wall of impenetrable silence. And then, slowly, Serafina blinked. It was one single, measured blink, her long lashes heavy with wine, before her eyes opened again, calm, cold, and utterly unflinching. It was the look of someone who had already made a decision. It was the look of someone who held the power to end this entire charade with a single thought. Isabella felt it. She took an involuntary step back, just a half step, but it was enough. Those watching noticed. Murmurs stirred again, different this time. "Did you see that? She's not even angry," someone whispered. Another voice replied, thick with a dawning unease. "No, she's waiting." Oh, the power in that observation. The CEO adjusted her posture slightly, a minute straightening of her spine in the chair. She lifted one hand, not to wipe away the wine, but to place it gently on the stem of her own water glass, her fingers curling around it with a quiet, unnerving certainty. The movement was small, almost insignificant, but it commanded the attention of the entire room. Her gaze never left Isabella. She let the silence stretch, a silence thick enough to drown the mocking giggles that tried and failed to spark back to life. The crowd leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the immense gravity of her stillness. And in that charged, breathless pause, something fundamental shifted. The spectacle no longer belonged to the woman in red. The spotlight had moved. Every eye was now on the drenched figure at the table, not as a victim, but as the calm, terrifying center of a storm that no one else could see coming. Isabella forced another laugh, too loud, too hollow. She waved to the crowd as if trying to reclaim their attention, but her eyes flicked nervously back to the woman she had tried and failed to humiliate. And what she saw staring back at her was not weakness. It was a warning. The banquet hall buzzed with a tension so thick it felt suffocating. Guests leaned closer to one another, their voices lowered, the unease spreading like a network of fine cracks across a sheet of glass. The wine kept dripping. The silence kept deepening. And at the center of it all, Serafina Vance's eyes told a story that no one else in that room dared to speak aloud. This isn't over. This is just the beginning. Isabella shifted her weight, the heels of her shoes clicking softly against the marble floor as she desperately tried to reclaim the rhythm of the room. Her smile widened, but it was brittle at the edges, the kind of aggressive grin that dared the crowd to laugh with her or risk standing against the formidable power of the sterling name. She twirled the empty wine glass in her fingers and let it dangle carelessly at her side. "Oops," she announced, her voice dripping with a mock innocence that fooled no one. "Guess I got a little carried away, but come on, everyone, look at her. She actually looks better this way, don't you think?" She gestured with a sweeping motion of her arm toward Serafina, who remained seated, silent, dripping wine like a statue carved from pure resolve. A few obedient chuckles followed her cue. A smattering of polite, hesitant applause rose from her loyal circle of friends, a desperate attempt to keep her fragile ego intact. One young man, whose father's company was deeply in debt to Sterling Global Holdings, even clapped too loudly, his laugh bouncing awkwardly around the hall like broken glass. But beyond that shallow, shrinking ring of supporters, the atmosphere in the room wavered. Guests exchanged wary, uncertain looks. A woman covered her palpable discomfort by taking a long, slow sip of champagne. An older gentleman, a patriarch of another powerful family, meticulously adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze fixed on the intricate pattern of the tablecloth rather than the spectacle before him. Isabella tilted her head back, basking in what she tragically mistook for admiration. She raised her chin, her red dress catching the light, the diamonds at her ears flashing with every exaggerated theatrical gesture. She was undeniably beautiful, a fact the society pages often noted. But tonight, her beauty had curdled into something sharp, arrogant, and ugly. She strutted around Serafina's chair like a predator circling its prey, a performer on a stage of her own making, her heels tapping out a sharp, staccato rhythm of disdain. "Tell me," she said, leaning in so close that her perfume, a cloying, overly sweet scent, filled the air. Her tone was a venomous whisper meant to carry. "How does it feel to sit among us, to wear your little bright orange dress and pretend you belong? Did you really think no one would notice you're an imposter?" The room held its breath. Every syllable was a deliberate strike. Every pregnant pause was a calculated insult. Isabella wanted to break her target, not just with wine, but with words. She wanted to strip away every layer of dignity, piece by piece, until nothing remained but raw, exposed shame. And then she laughed again, louder this time, shriller, turning her head toward the crowd as if to share the joke. "Don't be shy, everyone. Take a good long look. This is what happens when you climb too high, too fast." Phones flashed, glasses clinked, but the energy was thinner now, stretched taut and ready to snap. Even those who were still laughing could feel the profound unease churning beneath their own voices, the nagging, persistent thought that the joke, if it ever was one, had gone catastrophically too far. Serafina remained immovable. Her silence was beginning to feel less like passivity and more like a gathering storm just over the horizon. She did not speak, but her presence, her very stillness, said enough. Her gaze followed Isabella with a calm, unnerving precision, tracking her every exaggerated movement as though she were measuring the exact cost of each and every insult. Isabella tried to hold that gaze, but found herself glancing away, unable to withstand the sheer force of it. She spun again, tossing her hair, twirling her empty glass in frantic circles. She was leaning into her role, convinced that a powerful enough performance could erase the tremor of doubt that was beginning to creep into her chest. "Smile for the cameras!" she sneered, lowering her voice just enough for those nearest to hear, a final, nasty twist of the knife. "This will be the only headline you'll ever make." Her laughter spilled out once more, but it sounded different now. It was thinner, more desperate, fighting against the heavy, oppressive silence that was pressing back from the woman she had tried to destroy. And across the table, across the hall, people were beginning to see it. This cruel, pathetic show was no longer amusing. It was unraveling. Isabella Sterling didn't know it yet, but the moment she had decided to pour that glass of wine, she had lit a very long fuse. And the woman she had so gleefully mocked was the one holding the match. The laughter spread again, though thinner this time, as forced and unpleasant as champagne that had gone flat. A handful of guests, mostly the younger, more reckless ones, clapped their hands against the table, eager to keep the morbid mood alive, eager to stand on the side of what they perceived to be money and power. Their voices rose in a shallow chorus of agreement. "That's right." One young man with more hair gel than sense barked from the far end of the table, his diamond cufflinks catching the light as he raised his glass in a toast. Outsiders should learn their place. His words drew a ripple of uneasy chuckles. Another, emboldened by the first, leaned back in his chair with a theatrical creak and spoke louder than he should have. "If she wants to play with the giants, she better learn how to take a joke." His friends laughed too loudly, a desperate performance to prove they belonged to the same exclusive circle of cruelty. Isabella soaked it up like a dry sponge. She turned to them, grinning, her arms spread wide as if she were embracing the room itself. "See? They understand, she declared, her voice dripping with a satisfaction that was beginning to ring hollow. She basked in their fleeting attention, twirling her wineglass like a royal scepter. This is what happens when you forget where you came from. But cracks were forming in her fragile coalition of bullies. Not everyone was laughing. At the next table, a woman whispered sharply to her husband, her face tight with disgust. "This is ugly, Robert." He cleared his throat and glanced away, unwilling to meet her eyes, a coward in a $1,000 suit. At another corner of the room, the two investors exchanged another look, this one heavy with unspoken financial calculations. One murmured, so low only the other could hear, "She's their new lead partner on the global expansion, isn't she?" The other gave the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. Both fell silent, staring down at their plates, unwilling to join the farce. Yet, the cruel chorus kept going, a feedback loop of arrogance. Phones hovered higher, recording every humiliating second. One guest deliberately angled his camera to frame Serafina's drenched figure, zooming in on the dark streaks of wine running down her skin. He chuckled to himself, already imagining the witty, savage captions he would post later. "Smile!" someone shouted from across the hall, their voice slurring slightly with alcohol. "Give us a good shot for the gram!" A roar of laughter followed that comment, echoing off the marble columns, bouncing under the glittering, indifferent chandelier. Isabella twirled one last time, her red dress swirling dramatically around her legs. She blew a kiss to the crowd, delighting in their mock applause. "Don't forget this night," she cried, raising her empty glass high. "It's the night an imposter finally got exposed." She bowed with theatrical exaggeration, reveling in her performance. The loyal ring of guests clapped harder, their laughter rising again, a desperate attempt to feed her ravenous ego. But the energy was hollow, sustained only by habit and fear, not genuine joy. And in the center of it all, Serafina Vance still sat in silence. Her stillness only magnified the cruelty around her, reflecting every laugh and every jeer back onto those who had given it a voice. One guest noticed. He lowered his phone slowly, the sick feeling in his stomach finally overpowering his thirst for gossip. He slipped it into his pocket, his eyes flicking guiltily toward the floor. A woman near him stopped laughing mid-breath, covering her mouth as if suddenly ashamed of the sound she had just made. The balance was shifting, subtle but undeniable. Isabella, too intoxicated by her own bravado, didn't see it. She bowed again, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her laughter high and shrill. "This is who she is," she shouted, pointing a dramatic finger at the soaked woman at the table. "And this is all she'll ever be." The applause answered her, but it was softer this time, scattered, uncertain. The spell was breaking. Yet Isabella only smiled wider, blind to the silence that was growing in the spaces between the laughs. She believed with every fiber of her being that she was winning. She had no idea that the floor beneath her feet was already beginning to crack. The wine dripped slower now, the dark stains spreading across the vibrant orange fabric like an invasive bloom. But Serafina Vance did not move. She sat anchored, as though the chair itself were a throne, and the entire grand hall had, against its will, become her court. Her silence was not surrender, it was calculation. In her mind, insulated from the chaos around her, the scene replayed on a different screen. The signatures, crisp and black, scrolled across the thick parchment of the contracts signed that very morning. The press release, meticulously drafted but not yet published, announcing the landmark merger. The numbers, cold, hard, beautiful numbers that stretched into the billions. $5.8 billion, a partnership celebrated by the financial press as unshakable. And now, within the span of a single hour, her so-called partner's younger sister had turned that historic alliance into a cheap, public spectacle of humiliation. Isabella laughed again, a desperate, brittle sound tossing her hair as she clung to the fading echo of her own arrogance. "What's wrong?" she mocked, leaning in so close that her perfume clashed with the sour, acidic tang of the wine. "Cat got your tongue? I thought you powerful businesswomen always had something to say." Serafina's eyes didn't flicker. She studied her tormentor with an unnerving, almost scientific calm, her gaze slow and deliberate. She wasn't looking at the wine-soaked dress. She wasn't looking at the gawking crowd. She was looking at the arrogance itself, measuring it, weighing it, and deciding its precise cost. "You think this is power?" The thought whispered through the silence of her mind. A glass of wine, a hollow laugh, a crowd of sycophants eager to clap for cruelty. That's not power. That's a tantrum. Real power doesn't need an audience. Real power changes the numbers that built this very room. Real power can erase the ink on the contracts your family so desperately clings to. The din of voices around her blurred into a dull, meaningless hum. Every insult, every laugh, every whispered comment merged into a single, static background noise. All she could hear clearly was the echo of her own formidable resolve. She placed one hand flat on the table, the gesture steady, firm. It was a small movement, but it commanded attention. A few nearby guests glanced down, sensing a shift in the energy but unable to name it. Her other hand moved with equal care, lifting the folded linen napkin from her lap. She dabbed gently at her jawline, removing a single errant line of wine without hurry, without distress. It was not a gesture of weakness or a concession to the mess. It was a gesture of absolute control. Isabella smirked, seizing on the movement. "Finally! Cleaning yourself up, are we? It's about time." Her words were loud, meant to be heard across the room, but they stumbled in the air, brittle and weak against the profound silence that followed Serafina's calm, measured movements. Inside, the decision crystallized. Every insult, every laugh, every single drop of wine sliding down her skin was tallied, converted into a cold, hard calculation, and the sum was clear. $5.8 billion, erased with a single word. Her eyes rose once more, meeting Isabella's gaze directly. It was not a glare, not even a look of defiance. It was a look of pure, unadulterated certainty. The kind of certainty that unsettled even the most reckless and arrogant of souls. Across the hall, a few guests shifted uneasily in their seats. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it. The gathering storm behind those calm eyes, the crushing inevitability of consequence. Isabella faltered again, just for a second. She raised her chin higher, trying to smother the seed of doubt with another forced laugh. But the crack in her composure had already appeared. And in the silent space between them, Serafina Vance thought only one thing. "Your family believes they poured wine on me. They don't see that I'm about to pour billions of dollars out of their reach forever." The napkin slid back onto the table, folded with meticulous care, as though the crimson stain upon it meant nothing at all. Serafina's hands returned to their state of stillness. Her gaze swept the hall, not hurried, not seeking sympathy, merely observing. Each guest felt the distinct weight of her eyes as her gaze passed over them. Some averted their faces, suddenly fascinated by their dinner plates. Others pretended to take a sip of champagne, hiding behind their glasses. The air grew dense, fragile, every small sound, a cough, a clink of a fork, startlingly sharp against the silence she now commanded. Isabella, tragically, mistook that quiet for victory. She strutted closer, her heels striking the marble with a deliberate, aggressive rhythm. "There it is," she said loudly, turning to the crowd as if she were delivering the final line in a play. The silence of someone who knows, deep down, that she doesn't belong. A few people clapped on cue. A nervous, uncertain ripple of laughter followed, but Serafina remained utterly unbothered. Her stillness was no longer defensive. It was strategic. It was the calm before the execution. She reached for her phone, a sleek, black device lying beside her plate. The screen lit up softly in her palm, casting a faint glow on her composed face. Her fingers moved with an unhurried, terrifying precision, tapping once, twice. She lifted the phone to her ear. "Okay, let's pause here for a second. The whole room is watching, phones out. Who do you think holds the real power right now? The one with the loud mouth and the empty glass, or the one with the deafening silence and the phone in her hand? Drop your thoughts below. We are about to witness the tide turn in the most spectacular way imaginable." The shift in the room was immediate and absolute. The crowd leaned in, a collective body moved by a single thread of intense curiosity. Isabella tilted her head, her smirk returning. "Oh, is she calling for help? Maybe her driver can bring her a towel," she quipped. Her words were sharp, but her voice was a little too quick, a little too eager to fill the space that no longer belonged to her. Serafina's tone, when it finally came, was nothing like Isabella's desperate theatrics. It was calm, cold, and utterly devoid of emotion. Each syllable dropped like a piece of iron into the silence. "Michael," she said, "terminate the Sterling merger." A pause, just long enough for the entire world to stop spinning on its axis. Effective immediately. A hush fell over the room that was heavier, more profound than anything that had come before. The grand hall seemed to contract, the very air pressing inward. Even the string quartet in the corner, who had been nervously waiting for a cue to resume playing, stumbled in their silent waiting, their bows faltering in their hands. Conversations froze mid-whisper. Eyes widened. Glances darted from person to person. She ended the call without any flourish, setting the phone back down beside her plate as though it were a mere afterthought. Then she folded her hands once more, her posture steady, her eyes fixed forward. Isabella blinked. Her laugh caught somewhere in her throat. What did she say?" she asked, forcing another chuckle that rang completely hollow. No one answered her. The crowd's focus had shifted entirely. They no longer looked at the woman in the blood-red dress. Their eyes, wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror, were glued to the drenched figure at the table. The woman who had just spoken 9 words and, in doing so, may have just shifted the tectonic plates of their entire financial world. A man at the far end of the room pulled out his own phone, his fingers scrolling frantically through a financial news app. The color drained from his face. He nudged his neighbor, whispering urgently. Another guest's screen lit up, displaying a pre-market alert. The whispers grew faster, sharper, and more panicked. "She can't mean the deal. The merger announced today." "That's a $5.8 billion deal." Isabella's smile had now completely vanished. She tried to wave her empty glass again, to command their attention, but the gesture was weak, pathetic. "She's bluffing," she scoffed, but her eyes flickered around the room, betraying a rising tide of doubt. Serafina Vance said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder, more definitive than any declaration. The sheer, crushing weight of what she had just done began to settle across the hall, like volcanic ash after a catastrophic eruption. Isabella laughed one more time, a sound that was too loud, too strained, too desperate. But fewer people joined in this time. The performance was unraveling, and she was the only one who didn't realize how completely and irrevocably she had lost control. At the center of it all, soaked in wine yet utterly untouchable, Serafina Vance sat in perfect, terrifying composure. Her silence was no longer just a shield. It was now a verdict. The seconds stretched on, long and agonizing, every eye in the room darting between the immovable woman in orange and the unraveling woman in red. The low buzz of whispers grew into a frantic rumble as words collided, scattered, and rose again in a wave of panic. Somewhere near the back of the room, a phone chimed with a breaking news alert. Another followed. Then another. A cascade of digital alarms signaling a financial catastrophe in real time. The first man to glance at his screen went completely pale. "Oh my God," he muttered, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through the text. "It's real. Vance Innovations just issued a formal withdrawal from the merger agreement." His neighbor leaned over, his own eyes widening in disbelief at the numbers and legal jargon flashing across the small display. Soon, screens lit up all around the room like fireflies in a dying dusk. Notifications spread like a virus. The contract, the investment, the $5.8 billion, suddenly, irrevocably gone. The headlines weren't even written yet, but the financial tremors were already shaking the foundations of the grand ballroom. A woman in a glittering emerald gown clutched her husband's arm, her knuckles white. She couldn't have. The words trailed off into disbelief. She did, he whispered back, his own voice raw with shock. 5.8 billion, wiped clean, with a phone call. The string quartet had stopped pretending altogether. Their bocaux hung frozen above the strings of their priceless instruments, waiting for a permission to continue that would never come. The only rhythm left in the room was the sound of Isabella's heels clicking frantically against the marble as she paced back and forth, her smile now a grotesque, cracking mask of denial. "She's bluffing," she insisted, her voice louder now, desperate to be believed. "This is a party trick, a little drama, that's all it is." Her laugh was high and shrill, but no one echoed it this time. Not a single person. Every head in the room was bent over a glowing screen instead. Conversations snapped like live wires. "It's gone. Check the pre-market futures. I just got the same alert from my broker. Do you understand what this means for Sterling Global on Monday morning?" Isabella spun toward the crowd, her arms outstretched in a pleading gesture. "Why are you all staring at your phones? She can't do this. My brother, our family, we control this city." But her voice no longer filled the room. It was swallowed by the undeniable truth scrolling across every device, by the colossal weight of the silence that was building around the soaked figure who had uttered 9 simple words and undone an empire's worth of arrogance. Serafina Vance reached for her water glass, not the empty one that had been wielded like a weapon, but her own, still half full. She lifted it with a calm, unshaken hand, a hand that was steady despite the wine still dripping down her sleeve. She raised it to her lips, took a slow, deliberate sip, and then set it back down on the tablecloth with a quiet, graceful click. There was no announcement, no explanation, only an ocean of composure. The hall erupted, not with laughter, not with applause, but with a storm of whispers that felt louder than any cheer had before. Chairs scraped against the floor as guests leaned toward one another, frantically piecing together the cataclysm that had just unfolded. Some sat rigid in their seats, too stunned to move. Others were already scribbling notes on cocktail napkins, their minds already turning to the boardrooms and headlines that waited for them outside these gilded, insulated doors. Isabella's breathing quickened. She spun back toward the woman she had tried to humiliate, her red dress clinging to her as though even the fabric knew the fire had been extinguished. You think you can scare me with this little game? She demanded, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her completely. Serafina finally lifted her eyes again, as calm as ever, meeting her tormentor's gaze with the same unflinching, diamond-hard steel. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The room itself, with its chorus of panicked whispers and glowing screams, answered for her, because everyone in that room now understood, with chilling certainty. This wasn't theater. This was power. Raw, world-changing power. Isabella's laughter tried to rise one last time, a brittle, forced sound, but it broke before it could fill the room. The audience no longer belonged to her. The guests had shifted their allegiance. Their faces, now lit with the cold, blue glow of their screens, were masks of urgency and calculation. Their murmurs sharpened. No one cared for her theatrics anymore. They cared for numbers, for markets, for the earthquake that was trembling beneath their collective fortunes. One man near the head of the table, a notorious corporate raider, barked into his phone, his voice shaking with adrenaline. Sell all of our sterling holdings now, all of it. His words carried like a flare in the night, sparking more calls, more frantic whispers. A woman in silk gripped her clutch so tightly her knuckles whitened. She stared across the table at the drenched figure of Serafina Vance, and whispered, almost to herself, "She really did it." Isabella spun on her heels, her red dress fanning out dramatically, as if the movement alone could somehow pull the spotlight back to her. "Don't listen to her!" she shouted, but her words rang hollow, swallowed by the rising storm of financial panic. "She can't! She doesn't have the power! My brother, our family!" But the crowd wasn't listening to her anymore. They had seen enough. They had heard enough. The profound silence of Serafina Vance had spoken far louder and with infinitely more authority than her rival's shrill, pathetic protests. Serafina, still seated, adjusted her posture with an effortless, regal grace. She placed her hands flat against the wine-stained linen, her fingers relaxed, her eyes scanning the hall as though she were a general surveying her own conquered territory. The stains on her dress glistened in the chandelier light, but they no longer looked like marks of humiliation. They looked like battle scars. They looked like a crown painted in blood. One guest, the veteran investor from before, dared to speak the truth aloud. "She owns the floor now." His voice was low, but heads around him nodded in solemn agreement. It was undeniable. Isabella's mask of defiance finally cracked. She turned back toward Serafina, her voice trembling beneath the sheer weight of her fury. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she spat, the words brittle and sharp. "Do you know what family I come from?" Serafina lifted her gaze, unhurried. For the first time since the assault, she spoke again. Her tone was calm, clear, and cut through the air like a surgeon's blade. "I don't need to know who you are, Isabella." A devastating pause. "What matters is who you'll be after tonight." The line fell with the force of a guillotine across the banquet hall. Guests exhaled sharply, some gasping, others nodding as though they had been waiting for her to speak these exact words. The sentence was measured, not loud, yet it echoed with more power than all of Isabella's screams combined. Isabella Sterling staggered a step back, clutching her empty glass so tightly it was a wonder it didn't shatter in her hand. Her eyes, wide with a fear she could no longer hide, betrayed her. She tried to laugh it off, to twirl again, to do anything to reclaim a shred of her lost power, but her movements lacked the arrogant confidence of before. The performance was over, and she knew it. Meanwhile, Serafina Vance's silence returned, heavier and more conclusive than before. She had given them only one sentence, yet it was enough to fracture the entire night into a clear before and after. Around the room, guests whispered furiously, their voices weaving a brand new narrative, not of a socialite's cruel prank, but of a titan's reckoning. The wine on her skin glistened like firelight. The entire room, full of the most powerful people in the city, unconsciously bowed to her presence. And as she sat there, still as stone, Isabella finally realized something she had never believed possible. Her laughter, her name, her money, all of it had lost its power. Isabella Sterling stood frozen, her chest rising and falling too fast, her smirk stretched thin and grotesque across trembling lips. Around her, the grand banquet no longer resembled a celebration. It felt like a tribunal, and every single eye had turned not toward her, the accuser, but toward the woman she had tried to drown in wine. Serafina Vance leaned back slightly in her chair. It was not the slouch of a weary person, but the recline of a queen who is perfectly comfortable on her throne. The wine stains, once intended as symbols of ridicule, clung to her orange dress like medals of defiance. Each drip that still fell, touching the marble floor below, echoed louder than the forced, ugly laughter of just minutes ago. The phones were still raised, but their purpose had changed. No longer were they instruments of mockery. The guests were now recording history, their lenses framing Serafina not as a victim, but as a force of nature, immortalizing the exact moment the balance of power in their world had irrevocably shifted. One man whispered to his wife, his voice filled with awe, "We're watching history being made." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the drenched, magnificent woman in orange. Isabella tried one last, desperate appeal. "You all know my family. You all know my brother. We built this city." Her voice cracked, too shrill, too frantic. "She can't just erase us." But the room, and the world it represented, had already moved on. A cluster of investors were now huddled together, their hushed tones carrying across the silence. 5.8 billion gone with a single call. Another shook his head, pure awe etched into his features. She didn't even raise her voice. The weight of those words settled heavily over the assembly. Some guests now looked at Isabella with a sort of detached pity, others with open contempt, but none of them looked at her with the reverence she so desperately craved. The power of the Sterling name had evaporated before their very eyes. Serafina lifted her water glass again. Slowly, deliberately, she took another sip. The motion was unhurried, a quiet act of defiance that declared she owned not just her own dignity, but the entire room and everyone in it. The simple act was more powerful than any protest, more final than any verdict. And then she set the glass down with a soft, definitive click against the table. That sound carried more authority than all of Isabella's shouting combined. Finally, Serafina spoke again, her voice calm, steady, the kind of tone that carried further than any scream. "This room," she began, "celebrates wealth, power, and legacy, but you are all mistaken about what those things are." Her words slid through the crowd like electricity. Heads tilted forward, listening, absorbing. Phones recorded with renewed urgency. Isabella stiffened, her face flushing a deep, mottled red against the brilliant glow of the chandeliers. Serafina continued, never raising her volume, yet each word struck harder than the last. "You think these things are inherited in a glass of wine, in a family name. They're not. They are built. They are earned. And they are protected." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Tonight, you tried to humiliate me. You tried to remind me that I don't belong. But what you've actually done is remind everyone here that true power is not about spectacle. It's about consequence." A silence heavier than marble settled over the room. The guests sat motionless, waiting, watching, unwilling to miss a single breath of what might come next. Isabella Sterling clutched her empty glass like a shield, her knuckles white, her eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for someone, anyone, to rescue her from the silence that had turned so violently against her. But no one moved. All they saw now was the woman seated in orange, drenched but unshaken, whose calm presence made the grand hall itself feel like it had bent to her will. And in that silence, it became horrifyingly clear to everyone. Isabella wasn't in control anymore. She was simply standing in the ruins of her own arrogance, while Serafina Vance sat in the unshakable, immovable center of power. The air in the banquet hall was charged, as if lightning had struck but the thunder had not yet rolled. The guests sat rigid, their breaths shallow, their gazes pinned to the woman in orange who had, in the span of 10 minutes, transformed public humiliation into absolute dominance. Isabella's red dress shimmered under the chandelier, but its brilliance no longer commanded the room. It clung to her like a shroud of desperation, the fabric of someone who had lost everything. She tried once more, her voice trembling as she forced the words out. "This is nonsense. You can't just... Contracts, deals. They don't end like that. You think you can just walk in here and undo everything my family has built over a century?" Serafina's eyes lifted slowly, her stare locking onto Isabella with such calm finality that the younger woman faltered mid-sentence. The crowd leaned in, holding their collective breath. "Power," Serafina said, her voice soft, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Doesn't ask for permission." The sentence wasn't shouted, it wasn't dramatic, but it landed with a weight that crushed every last whisper of defiance in the hall. The guests froze, their phone screens glowing faintly in their hands, capturing a line that would echo in boardrooms and on trading floors for years to come. Isabella's lips parted, but no words came out. For the very first time in her privileged, insulated life, she looked small. Her glass trembled, her laughter was a distant memory, her arrogance was unraveled and gone. From the far end of the table, the older man in the tailored suit muttered under his breath, "She's finished." Another leaned closer, replying grimly, "No, they're finished. All of them." The murmurs swelled again, but this time they carried a completely different tone. It wasn't mockery, it wasn't scorn, it was fear, it was respect, and it was awe. The tide had turned completely, and everyone in the room knew it. Serafina adjusted her posture, the wine still dripping faintly from the hem of her dress, and rested her chin lightly against her hand. She didn't need to speak further. Her silence was now the verdict, her composure, the sentence. Isabella stumbled a step back, her high heels catching for a moment against the smooth marble. She looked around frantically for support, for the friends who had laughed so eagerly with her, for the allies who had clapped at her cruelty. But their eyes refused to meet hers. They were too busy looking at the woman she had tried, and failed, to shame. The woman who had, instead, revealed herself to be completely untouchable. Even the string quartet, still frozen in the corner, seemed to be waiting on Serafina's unspoken command to resume their music. The entire hall had realigned itself around her presence. Isabella finally slammed her empty glass down on a nearby side table. The crystal, unable to withstand the force, cracked with a sharp, splintering sound. "This isn't over," she hissed, though her voice shook too much to be convincing. She spun away, her red dress swirling like a fire being snuffed out, and stormed toward the exit. But her departure was not a triumph. It was a retreat. Serafina Vance did not rise. She didn't need to. She simply watched, her eyes steady, until the grand doors closed behind the woman in red. The silence that followed was thick, absolute. And then, slowly, the whispers began again. Not about scandal, but about legacy, about power, about the $5.8 billion that had been shifted with a single phone call, and about the woman who had endured a vicious, public humiliation, yet had walked away as the only name that truly mattered. In that moment, the grand hall itself seemed to bow, not to the wealth that was inherited, but to the strength that was earned. The heavy doors shut with a hollow, final thud, and the echo lingered like the last note of a requiem. Isabella Sterling was gone, but the weight of her arrogance still hung in the air, now stripped bare for all to see. What had begun as a vicious spectacle had ended in a profound silence, a silence that belonged entirely to the woman still seated at the center of the hall. Serafina Vance lifted her water glass one final time. The chandelier's glow danced across its rim, and for a heartbeat, the crowd saw not the ugly stains on her dress, not the wine still dripping faintly to the marble floor, but the unshakable poise of a leader who had turned mockery into mastery. She took a slow, deliberate sip, set the glass down with graceful finality, and looked around the room. One by one, eyes dropped before hers. Phones were lowered. Whispers died. No one dared to laugh now. No one dared to sneer. The guests who had so eagerly joined in the cruelty earlier sat rigid in their chairs, a pool of shame gathering in their silence. Others, those who had watched with a quiet unease, now leaned forward with a respect they could no longer disguise. She spoke, her voice steady, low but carrying with effortless ease through the suddenly reverent hall. "Dignity," she said, "doesn't vanish when wine is poured on it. It doesn't shatter under the weight of laughter. Dignity endures, and tonight every single person in this room learned who truly holds it." The words settled like stone, immovable, undeniable. A murmur spread, but this time it wasn't one of mockery or panic. It was one of acknowledgement. Investors exchanged glances heavy with new calculations. A woman at the far end whispered to her companion, "She owns this room. She owns the future." The reply came as a grim, certain nod. "And she owns the deal that is now gone forever." At last, Serafina rose to her feet. The movement was slow, unhurried, yet it rippled through the hall like a clap of thunder. The stains on her saffron dress glistened under the light, but they no longer looked like shame. They looked like proof that even when drenched in cruelty, she stood untouchable. Chairs scraped as some guests instinctively rose with her, unsure whether it was respect or fear that moved them. The string quartet, still silent, lowered their bows altogether, sensing the night had passed far beyond the realm of music. She turned toward the exit. Her steps were measured, each one echoing in the vast silence. No one blocked her way. No one dared. As she passed, the sea of powerful guests shifted, parting like subjects before their sovereign. Just before she reached the door, she paused. She looked back once, not at the empty space where Isabella had stood, not at the shattered glass left behind, but at the crowd itself. Her gaze swept over them, calm and resolute. "Power doesn't come from spectacle," she said, her final words a lesson they would never forget. "It comes from what you do after the spectacle is over." And with that, she stepped through the doors, leaving behind a hall drenched not in laughter, but in awe. The guests sat frozen in her wake. The whispers, the headlines, the market crash, all of it would come later. But for now, the silence said it all. She had entered the evening as a guest they thought an outsider. She left it as the only name that mattered. And that's how you turn a public shaming into a masterclass in power. What a story. What did you take away from this incredible display of strength and strategy? Let's discuss it in the comments below. And if you found this story as powerful as I did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we have so many more incredible stories of justice and empowerment to share. Thanks for watching.